This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. We are a member of the Parthenon podcast network. Of course, a big thanks goes out to our guest, Josh Cohen, host of the Unfiltered podcast and the upcoming Parthenon podcast network podcast, Eyewitness History. Josh is the content editor for the History on the Net website. Links to learn more about Josh and the Unfiltered podcast, along with his new Eyewitness History podcast, can be found at unfilteredpodcast.blogspot.com or in the show notes. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon and Subscribestar. By joining on Patreon and Subscribestar, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen going and get many great benefits. Go to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen or subscribestar.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. Another way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help other people learn about the Beyond the Big Screen podcast. More about the Parthenon Podcast Network can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies, on various social media platforms by searching for A2Z History. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I thank you for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen. Today, we're joined again by Josh Cohen to talk about the 2015 Quentin Tarantino film, The Hateful Eight. This movie, like all Quentin Tarantino films, bends and blends genres. It's driven by strong characters, plot twists, and, as a warning, a great deal of violence. I think if you're at all familiar with Quentin Tarantino films, you have to realize it's violence in them. So I know I'm really excited to talk about this movie, and I'm really excited to talk with Josh again about Quentin Tarantino films. We're going to go through his whole filmography. So we've started, and now we're here at The Hateful Eight. Just to get an overall view before we dive into the overview, what did you think about this movie in particular?
Yeah, well, first off, Steve, thanks for having me back. I had such a blast in our last podcast, and I couldn't be happier that we're doing a string of these. If it's Quentin Tarantino, I can always make the time. What I thought of it probably won't be a surprise to you that I loved the movie, which did actually surprise me somewhat given the texture of the movie itself. I'm sure we'll talk about this. The movie is set up very much like a play in the sense that there's only a few characters and there's only really one setting for the action to take place. And by and large, I tend to despise movies that only have one setting. I can never shake this feeling of being cheated. I watched a horrible movie way back in the day called The Boss's Daughter with Tara Reid and Ashton Kutcher, and it was one scene basically the entire movie, and I'll never forget how cheated I felt. So I came into it prejudiced, but of course Quentin Tarantino healed me of that very quickly.
Well, this is a part of the context too, in which I think for me, what that one setting was kind of for me quaint, but it really threw me back to the Alfred Hitchcock, like Rope, where everything happens in that one room or two rooms in the apartment, and I thought that was a really fun way to do it. I thought it was, for this format, it was engaging. I could see if it was an Ashton Kutcher movie, it might be a different story. And Tara Reid movie, it might be a different story. I don't recall seeing that, but I think that the way this was filmed, the setting and the whole concept, it worked.
Well, yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, if you watch the movie, he uses multiple cameras. Obviously, he does do the 70 millimeter, and he creates depth in the scene with the characters. You see the other characters in the background if the camera's focused on Major Marquez Warren, for instance, right? but I think he does enough tricks with the camera and with perspective to make you think that you're in multiple areas. You could, you're watching Tim Roth as Oswald Mowbray do his thing while you're watching Walton Goggins as the sheriff, supposedly. Maybe we'll talk. Do his thing in the corner, and you could be fooled by thinking it wasn't occurring in the same room.
So, as usual, we'll get into specifics and plenty of spoilers in this conversation. But just to set the stage, this movie is a Western. It's a Western. It's a mystery. It's a one-setting play. Just to get us set up, Kurt Russell, he has a character named John the Hangman Ruth, who's a bounty hunter, and he's traveling on a stagecoach with his bounty. And this is the one scene, the stagecoach traveling through the snow is the one piece that's not set in this one building, but we'll get to that. He has his bounty, Daisy Domergue, played by Jennifer Jason Leigh. Ruth is in a hurry to get her to this fictional town of Red Rock, Wyoming, in order to collect his $10,000 bounty and beat the blizzard that's rolling in. As they're traveling, they run upon Major Marquis Warren, played by Samuel L. Jackson, who's stuck on the side of the road. He convinces Ruth to let him into the stagecoach because he also has 3 bounties who are dead, who he wants to bring to Red Rock. They finally set off again. They run into Chris Mannix, as played by Walter Goggins, as Josh mentioned, who claims to be the new sheriff of Red Rock. They take him in as well. Finally, they stop at Minnie's Haberdashery, a traveler's rest of sort for refuge from this blizzard. And that's where things get interesting. There's a whole new set of characters there. Four or five come off of the stagecoach, and then there's several other characters. We'll get into the details of that, who are at Minnie's Haberdashery. And this is particularly where the movie gets interesting, because all sorts of unusual alliances fall apart. And so, I mean, really, where to begin? I would say one place where I thought it might be interesting to start is, as a real Quentin Tarantino fanatic, you might say, how do you think that this one fits in with his larger body of work? As of this point in 2022, it's his second to last movie. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood's his latest. So this was the movie just previous to that. It came out in 2015. So he's had, at that point, 8 movies that he's produced and directed to that point. How do you think it fits in?
Well, I mean, it was obviously critically and commercially well received. One thing that caught my eye when I looked at the numbers was that it broke Tarantino's streak of having movies that became his highest grossing. And I better give some context for that. He comes out with Inglourious Bastards, to be followed by Django Unchained. When Inglourious Bastards came out, it was his highest grossing movie ever. It made the most money for him. That was his record. And then Django came out, and it was the exact same thing. That became his highest grossing. Hateful Eight broke that streak. And I can never quite shake this feeling that it's the one setting play that may have caused an issue for audiences. I'm not quite sure. As far as where it fits in, as you point out, it's certainly genre bending. Yeah, that'll work. Blending or bending works. And one wouldn't be watching a Tarantino movie if one wasn't sufficiently confused of what the genre was. We see Tarantino play a little bit further with that bounty hunter fetish that we were talking about in the last podcast, starting with Django, moving through Hateful Eight, and obviously ending at Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Maybe let's, since it is this one setting play essentially at Minnie's Haberdashery, maybe explain that one setting to us, because that setting is almost a character in and of itself.
Yeah, Steve, you took the words right out of my mouth. The setting, and indeed the environment. So it's the haberdashery and the storm that encroaches on the haberdashery like just this monster. It almost has a presence in and of itself. Well, the haberdashery, as you point out, is a refuge from the storm for all of these characters, and it's said multiple times by multiple characters that they're stuck for a couple of days. I think they said like at least 3 days until the storm clears. So it's quite literally a small little shack out in the middle of nowhere, ran by Minnie, and her husband. I believe it was Dave, Sweet Dave. That's right, Minnie and Sweet Dave. All the characters sort of coalesce there, and that's when the fun really begins. The characters are start off, obviously, as you point out, in the snow. You have John the Hangman Ruth, you have Major Marquess Warren, and you have Chris Mannix. And what fascinates me is if you think about the characters and their dynamics, they all knew each other already. You will recall that John Ruth and Major Marquess Warren shared a stake in Chattanooga 6 months prior, and both of them knew Chris Mannix more or less. John Ruth really knew him, and Marquess didn't know him himself, but he knew his father, Erskine Mannix of Mannix's Marauders, which could probably best be described as a lost cause domestic terrorist organization, which effectively sets Walton Goggins' Chris Mannix up as being the worst guy in the movie, having been a domestic terrorist, and on top of that, obviously a racist, obviously someone who was not out of sympathy with the idea of slavery, right? And that's when, in my opinion, that's the most interesting relationship dynamic there, is with Chris Mannix and Major Warren.
Even going back just a little bit to the very first scene where Marquess Warren and John Ruth meet up with each other, I found it so odd. And as I watched it again and again, Ruth, he recognized, it takes him a little bit to recognize Warren. Then he recognizes him, and you get the sense that they're just casual acquaintances. And then they say, "Oh, we shared that dinner in Chattanooga," and you think, "Oh, well, I mean, it's so they're so odd about it. That must have happened years ago, maybe even before the Civil War." And then they say that it happened 8 months ago. I thought that was so strange, the way that they were so standoffish with each other, even though that they had dined with each other within the year. It's
fascinating to me, and leave it to Tarantino to leave us wanting more and chomping at the bit on exposition. Because I don't know about you, but all I could think about is I want to see that steak dinner. I want to know what happened. I want to know who it was with, because my best guess is the two of them had a mutual friend that brought them to dinner somewhere, and then there they were. And that's also, of course, where Warren introduces the Lincoln letter. So I think I mentioned in our last conversation that Tarantino relies extremely heavily on bursts of dialogue to set up exposition. So in their very first conversation, as you point out, they're standoffish, but they seem to have some sort of a friendly past. It has to be assumed that it was a friendly interaction at that dinner.
It might be a good time to stop and discuss this. There is a lot of racialized language there's a lot. And then there's a lot of misogyny too. We haven't talked much about Daisy Domergue, but they beat her to a pulp. Anytime she says something, they beat her. Maybe tackle which one you want. Which landmines field do you want to walk through?
Well, let's take Domergue, because I think I have a few more bullets in the chamber on that one. Right. So with Daisy Domergue, as you point out, I mean, Tarantino caught a lot of stuff, let's say, on the issue of misogyny and women beating, and how Daisy Domergue, played brilliantly by Jennifer Jason Leigh, is just constantly being beaten up. I think what saves Tarantino, in my view, are a couple things. Number one, they made Daisy Domergue the worst character, the nastiest character you could wish for, right? She's a killer. She's everything you could possibly want in a horrible villain, number one. Number two, Tarantino is well known for making very strong female characters. The obvious one's going to have to be the bride, obviously, Uma Thurman's character. But even the femme fatale characters, the feminine characters, Uma Thurman again in Pulp Fiction, right? Jackie Brown is a great example of a strong, independent, in many cases conniving, scheming, but in any case fierce woman lead. So I don't know. I don't know that the thread of misogyny could run through his entire filmography. And in any case, let's be fair. Daisy Domergue is she really getting it that much worse than anyone else in the movie? I mean, everyone takes their lumps on this one, it seems to me.
She's really interesting because you said she's crass, she's foul, she's an accused murderer. We find out she's the sister of a gang leader who are murderous gang. Again, with her, they hide so much of her and they build up. I think that's what's really interesting about Tarantino is he sets us up on one expectation, and then one scene completely fills up all the backstory of that character, and it completely changes how you view her and many of the characters.
Perfect example of that, of a gap being filled. The entire movie, you're not quite sure what Daisy is, what her story is. You know, John Roos says that she's a no good, lying, murdering, etc. It's explained that she's worth $10,000. That's the bounty, but it's never explained why. And it's well established that that's a ton of money, and no one can quite justify why. And then it's not until at the very end, it's found out that it's because she's part of this gang, and every member of the gang is worth $10,000 bounty.
I think that's particularly interesting because we don't learn that it's her gang in the haberdashery that's there to spring her. One thing that I think is really interesting in the character development is that Ruth and Warren are bounty hunters, which, I mean, bounty hunters, even in the Old West movies, they're not lawmen. They kind of live in the gray zone between law and the lawless. Yet you have Mannix, who's the incoming sheriff of Red Rock, and you have that play that this Mannix is a really terrible guy, but he's actually the legitimate law figure there. Yet you have Ruth and Warren, who are bounty hunters, who are in the gray zone. And I thought that was really, what did you think about that interplay between those two lines?
Yeah, I thought that play of themes was very interesting indeed. I've come to expect nothing less from Tarantino. Well, and also I can add, Tim Roth as Oswaldo Mowbray has that little speech about frontier justice versus, I think you just called actual justice. As far as Mannix being the sheriff, yeah, that fascinated me too, because I know it's sort of a theme that's played with throughout the movie of whether he indeed was a sheriff, was elected sheriff, or was it just somebody said to get on the stagecoach? I personally think, just for the record, that he was telling the truth for a couple reasons. Number one, if his motivation to say that he was a sheriff was just to get on the stagecoach, he could have dropped that the second they got to the haberdashery, but he didn't. If anything, he doubled down, right? And then the second is the obvious one, where he asks Oswald Mowbray for the papers of Lance Lawson, who was the person that killed the sheriff prior to Chris Mannix coming in. Just a really quick, not to digress for just a moment. Lance Lawson was the name of Quentin Tarantino's supervisor way back in the day when Tarantino worked at the video store.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, there's a documentary kind of chronicling Tarantino's rise, and in it they discuss, they say Lance Lawson, supervisor so and so. So that's Tarantino's little wink to the old days.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. In a lot of ways, it's the way all of their backgrounds are obscured. It's almost like the blizzard, and it doesn't really matter. Red Rock doesn't even really matter. It's like a mirage, and I think that that's really where they leave us at the end of the movie, is that everything was all funneling to Minnie's haberdashery. It's almost in a way Twilight Zone-esque.
Yeah, Red Rock is the green light in The Great Gatsby. It's that thing that's just howling at you through the fog that you can't quite get to. If only for this wretched storm, right? And this wretched blizzard. Yeah, and I think that plays into the wonderful mystery aspect of the movie also, is that all the backstory of all the characters is kept intentionally vague, but also it's kept shifting. Your perceptions of who they are, and what they mean to you as far as morality, their moral compass, is perpetually obscured. In my opinion, you're ultimately landed with Major Marquess Warren as the moral guiding star, despite the fact that he, raped someone.
I think that in a lot of ways, this movie, if you strip away the Western element to it, it's a Alfred Hitchcock and an Agatha Christie movie or play combined. There's so many aspects of it, especially the soliloquies and the monologues that Marquis will do, where he's logicking out what he thinks is happening. I mean, that's almost straight out of Hitchcock.
When the crime is committed, let's say, we'll go through that, I'm sure. He runs through step by step for the audience how he arrives to the conclusion that he's arrived at, and then he acts on those conclusions promptly.
The big thing to talk about now is the coffee. It keeps coming up, the coffee. We're going to come in and get some coffee and hot coffee. What is the whole point of the coffee, and what happens with the coffee?
Yeah, well, the coffee motif, let's call it, was extremely interesting because there's got to be cleaner ways of killing someone, certainly smarter ways. My own, I only kind of reached this conclusion the last time I watched it, which was could well have been the 30th time I've seen it. But I personally think that the coffee was poisoned before John Ruth even arrived. So, he gets in and he pours coffee for himself, and he pours some for Daisy as well. She just stands around smelling it. Now, you'll remember he takes a sip and then immediately spits it out and, says how awful it is. And he even throws the coffee on the floor. And then Oswaldo, I think it was, says that, we were too polite to say anything. Right. And in my opinion, that's right when we would have known that something should have been wrong. Because once you reach the end of the movie, you realize very quickly that they're the exact sorts of people that would have said something if the coffee was terrible. Also, the coffee was completely full. There was no one had drank it clearly, and despite the fact there was a freshly brewed pot. Later on in the film, that's how John Ruth meets his end, is when he's poisoned. So that likely was the best idea for assassinating him. But yeah, if you watch the film, you realize John Ruth's the only one that ends up drinking it. Oh, and Obi, obviously, from the second cup. I mean, the first pot, John is the only one that takes a sip from it.
Just to wrap up the coffee, Ruth pours out the first pot, but then the coffee gets spiked again with poison. And it happens at a particular point because Warren has some of the coffee, and Warren is the only person who I believe has a drink of the fresh pot of coffee that's unpoisoned, but then it gets poisoned again. And that's a pretty key moment in the movie because that kind of lets us in on the secret.
Yeah, it lets us in on the secret, and it also lets us know that there's no prisoners in this one. The coffee thing, I think, was a way of showing the audience that there's no one particular target necessarily. Everyone and anyone can be killed. There's no plot armor for anybody, right? And that's shown certainly with Chris Mannix when he very nearly takes a sip and would have otherwise died had he. And of course with Obi, who we find out is just as expendable as any of them.
We go through a long exposition, but then it stops and it gives all of the backstory to what was happening in the haberdashery as Mannix, Warren, and Domergue and Ruth are on the stagecoach approaching the haberdashery, and maybe set that up and why Tarantino did it that way, that he shows, because then it all unfolds from there. The rest of the movie, that's the climax in a way, and it's all downhill after that.
Well, I think he was trying to keep that mystery theme alive, because we're as stumped as Major Marquess Warren is about who they are, what they're doing. There's maybe even, I don't know if you maybe thought differently, Steve, but my first time watching the movie, my brain went, okay, only one of them is bad, and it's probably Joe Gage, Michael Madsen's character. I thought Oswaldo Mowbray was on the level, because after all, he had those papers. Maybe we can talk about that. And then I figured Bob was fine too, because he works for Minnie. That's of course before the revelation of Samuel Jackson's of Major Warren saying that Minnie hated people of the Hispanic persuasion, let's say. So yeah, I think just to keep that mystery theme alive, and the big reveal at the end when you realize that Jody, that was his name, Channing Tatum's character, Jody Domingre, was the leader and indeed the brother of Daisy.
I love that flashback scene.
It was
I
awesome.
loved it, how it tied through everything, and everything made sense completely. But maybe set up that scene though that's right before the flashback scene, because that was shocking, and I thought that was so unexpected. It was the last thing on earth I would have expected to happen.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so to set the scene up, this is right after they discover who poisoned the coffee. Everyone's up against the wall, save for Chris Mannix and Major Warren. Major Warren basically uncovers a bloodstain that's on a chair, and then at that point, then it flashes back to the stagecoach that's comprised of Oswald Mowbray, Bob, Jody Domingre, and Joe Gage. How about that? I got all four names off the top of my head. And they're introduced by I forget her name, but Zoe Bell's character, who's the stunt woman that Tarantino likes.
Judy.
That's right, Six Horse Judy. Yeah, that's right. Introduced by Six Horse Judy, and then from there we learn everything from where the bloodstain came from and how. We learn about that damn jelly bean that was causing me fits the entire movie, because I knew that jelly bean that Major Marcus Warren discovers in kind of the cracks of the floor. I knew it was significant, but I couldn't place it how. And then I always got the impression that Sanford Smithers was something like a prop being used in the movie, only because he never gets up. The fact that he never got up and that was never explained away by some kind of war injury. Indeed, when he's talking to Major Marcus Warren, he says, "I got both my arms and both my legs. That's good enough for me." Having, of course, served in however many wars. Channing Tatum, as Joey Dominguez, plans how they're going to do this. They dump the bodies. They're going to keep Sanford Smithers around as a prop. Just adds a bit of texture to the environment. They hide those guns all around the haberdashery, and then Joey Domingre goes into the basement, the pantry, to basically wait. And then their plan at that point is to kill John Ruth and then free his sister. But then, of course, as Major Marcus Warren points out, the gang doesn't count on the Blizzard and doesn't count on Chris Mannix or Major Marcus Warren, and that's where the fun begins in terms of the film.
Right as soon as Samuel L. Jackson, Major Warren, is figuring this all out, and he's going in on a long monologue of how it's all figured out, and then that ends with him getting shot by Joey Domingre from the basement. Yeah. And that's where it all fell apart for me, like just utter shock, because at that point, Samuel L. Jackson's going to die. He lives on for a while, but he's gravely, mortally wounded.
Yeah, and stuck in this cabin for 3 days, as they all are. That's why I'm firmly of the impression that they all died. But that was a codifying scene for me also, when the camera pans down and it shows Joey Domingue for the first time, say adios to your huevos, and shoots up to the floor. That's when the whole movie is stepped up. And then that's when Channing Tatum's character is actually introduced to the audience in that flashback scene that immediately follows.
It's probably worth talking about the scene between Marquis and Smithers. My question after that is, why do you think that scene was included?
I think the reason that the scene was included was just to provide some expositional backdrop to why they would hate each other. Because as far as we're concerned, they just met. I mean, Marcus Warren might have a passing familiarity with the name, saying Sanford Smithers, so that's on that. As far as the scene itself, yeah. So Sanford Smithers is in the chair where he does not move the entire movie, and he immediately recognizes Smithers from the Battle of Baton Rouge, where both of them fought on opposing sides. So that sets it up. Now it leaks through the dialogue of Major Warren that Sanford Smithers is a butcher, his kind, particularly known for killing black soldiers. He even says we shoot them where they stand. They don't have the food, the time, or the inclination. So that immediately sets up a very visceral hatred, which comes out in the next conversation between Major Marcus Warren and Smithers. And also, it's worth mentioning, Chris Mannix absolutely reveres General Smithers, because he's apparently something of a legend in Southern racist circles. It's revealed that Sanford Smithers knew Chris Mannix's father, Erskine, through wartime experiences, said that he respected his resolve, and you immediately see Chris Mannix sort of humbled and abject in the presence of Smithers. So the dynamic is, I think, set and fortified in a very clear way between the three of them.
I think of everybody in the movie, and I'm interested for what you think. All of the, obviously, Kurt Russell, he's really over the top, and Samuel L. Jackson's character it has a naturalism to it, but there's also a lot of over the top nature. And Walton Goggins is really theatrical and over the top. But I think the way Bruce Dern played Smithers, there was something very natural and real about it, because in a way, he really was just a prop. He was as much as a chair, and literally a chair. He never got up out of the chair. And his character could have been very fantastical and very played over the top, but he plays it in such a natural way.
Yeah, I guess at this point I'll have to do a shout out to the casting director here, because I think it's just absolutely perfect casting. Bruce Dern literally looks like he just stepped right off of a war field after having shot a black soldier. And part of that is also, he plays a slaveholder in Django Unchained, the previous movie. So there's a bit of a familiarity with that sort of character profile, whatever that really looks like. As far as over the top, I think understated is the perfect way of describing Sanford Smithers. He seems to act exactly like you expect him to. He's probably the most up the middle character, and I suspect Tarantino didn't see a great deal in developing him a great deal, because, as you point out, I think correctly, he acts as a prop. Now, John Ruth, I'd love to pick on him for just a second, where we talk about his over-the-top energy. I think that's never better exemplified than when he's the hangman, after all, right? He never takes them, he never shoots them. He always takes them in to hang. And, of course, there's that little back and forth that, Colonel Warren, no one said the job was supposed to be easy. And then, Jackson says, well, no one said it had to be that hard either.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it's ever really fully explained why he specifically goes for letting them hang. I think that was a good element of sort of over the topness and sort of an inexplicable motive held within the character that, as I say, isn't fully explained in exposition or in dialogue.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. You had mentioned the score, and the score is fantastic by Ennio Morricone. What did you think about the score? And there's some background with the score, because Tarantino and Morricone had worked together before on a score, I believe, in one of the previous movies, and it did not go exactly well. So I'm wondering, what did you think about the score and maybe some of the background?
Yeah, I mean, Ennio Morricone, legendary score composer. I mean, right up there with the Hans Zimmer, for instance. His music is or Morricone's music is a bit more understated than Mr. Zimmer's. But the previous movie that he worked on with Tarantino was Inglourious Bastard. No, excuse me, Django Unchained, I believe. Actually, you know what? I think it was both of them. No, he was. I'm going to backtrack. He was originally set to do Inglourious Bastards, but he had a scheduling conflict. He was scoring a movie by Giuseppe Tornatore called Baria. Told you I was a nerd.
Yeah, that's a deep dive.
Yeah, good grief. As far as the work on Hateful Eight, as you point out, phenomenal score. One of the things I love about Tarantino is his passion and love and enthusiasm for movies shows through not just in the movies themselves, but in many cases their presentation. With Grindhouse, for instance, that was released as a double feature because it was to the point was to keep in touch with the tradition of a Grindhouse double feature. So it was two movies, Planet Terror and Death Proof, that were released that way. Similar to in the Hateful Eight, he released it in the manner of an old style type of movie. And what I mean by that was good long intro, setting, not even setting anything up, but just introducing us to the environment. Because if you watch the movie, there's like 7 or 8 minutes of just the camera in the snow surveying the gorgeous Wyoming landscape, right? Accompanied beautifully by Ennio Morricone's score. And Ennio, he won his first Oscar for that score. He was 87 at the time, and he was the oldest person to win, I think, a competitive Oscar, if I don't miss my mark. So yeah, that's the story on the score. Beautifully done.
Maybe tell us a little bit more about the way the movie was released back in 2015. That's a little unusual.
Yeah, well, the first couple weeks it was released with, I think, I may be wrong. Let's let our listeners fact check me. But I believe it was released with 7 or 8 minutes of extra footage, separate from the full on release. You know, in the however many weeks following it. And then also they, because I remember I did it. I went with friends of mine to go see it. They had an intermission, about a 10-minute intermission between scenes. I think it was right after Sanford Smithers is shot by the good Colonel Warren. They literally had an intermission where you go out into the lobby, and they also gave you pamphlets, little booklets, which is in keeping with traditional movies, that they would give you a whole pamphlet that basically what he was trying to recreate was the feeling of going to the movies as an experience. It's not something to do when you have a couple hours to kill or what have you. It is your night out. It is your night out. So yeah, he keeps in contact with that tradition by the pamphlet, by the intermission, and certainly, in my opinion, by slowing things way down with that intro and Morricone's score.
It felt that beginning scene was like an old school Western. That really long beginning and those big dramatic sweeps, but it was times 10 because that music was unbelievable.
Haunting.
Wouldn't hear that. You'd hear something approaching that in a Western. It was like that to perfection. And those opening sweeping scenes was from an old Western, but done 100 times better. Josh, you brought that up about the Lincoln letter, and that's a key component of this entire movie. Before we even move any further and we get towards the end of the conversation, and really, in short, the Lincoln letter, that's something that Samuel L. Jackson says that he has a letter written from Abraham Lincoln to him, and it's a very personal letter. But what do we find out about this letter?
Yeah, so as a very quick setup, it's established via dialogue and so forth that Major Marquess Warren and the at the time President Abraham Lincoln were pen pals. As Chris Mannix brings up, pen pals practically a friend. So you're saying that you're friends with the president. It takes that sort of tone, and that the impression is given. No, it's flat out said that there were multiple letters, as they say they were pen pals. Major Warren keeps this on his person because you just never know when it might come in handy. So that's the quick backstory on it. They're all having dinner. They're eating the stew in the dining room at the haberdashery, and Walton Goggins' character Chris Mannix comes out and says that it's a fake, and he laughs in the face of John Ruth, who up until that point had believed Major Warren that it was real. So in short, make a long story short, which might be too late at this point, right? It's discovered that the Lincoln letter was completely fake. And in fact, at the very end, for the first time in the entire movie, Chris Mannix reads the letter out loud, so we actually know what the content is, and then he balls it up. And the very last shot, I think, of the movie is him throwing it off to one side.
How do we find out exactly that it was fake? Mannix figures out it's fake.
Yeah, so Mannix figured it was fake because there was no way that someone who was drummed out of the cavalry with a yellow stripe down his back, as Mannix said, and a figure of the colonel's, the major's notoriety, there's no way he would have been friends with Abraham Lincoln. So then he says it's a fake. I think, in my opinion, the real question is why Major Warren would cop to the fact that it was a fake. Why wouldn't he just go along, keep going with it? Say, no, this was real.
I kind of felt that when Mannix did that, he had a strong suspicion that it was fake. And I think he said that as a bluff to see I think he called the bluff on Warren. Ruth believes it unquestioningly, and in a way, why wouldn't you? Even though, and I think that the way Warren treated the letter, he set it up that the way he punched out Domergue when she spat on the letter, and he's so protective of the letter, and I think that goes to your point. Why didn't he could have played it out? You're a racist Confederate, you don't know anything about the letter. I wonder what made him recognize his bluff was called and he folds.
Well, you pointed out earlier how Major Warren could be looked at as a bit of a braggart, as a rather bombastic, flamboyant character, right? And I think hubris, to use the word again, I know I used it in our last podcast. I think hubris reared its head here as well, because I think that Colonel Warren just decided to cop to it, confident in the fact that he would have been protected. That in other words, that he had used it to achieve the means he was trying to achieve, and therefore he didn't need it anymore.
He really did wreck his reputation with Ruth after that, though.
Yeah, I mean, they were pretty. They had sort of an agreement to be sort of icily polite, icily friendly. I'll help you protect your 8, you help me protect my 10, and so forth, right? They shake hands on it. Back when it meant something to shake hands on something and to make a promise. And then that trust is violated when and that's why I say it was some posturing on Warren's part. I think part of it was saying to John Ruth, you don't know who and what I am, and you never will.
We learned so much about Marquis Warren through that. I wonder if it's that nobody had ever called him on it, and that the fact that it's maybe Mannix really did read the situation completely, and it so utterly destroyed that facade of the letter that he couldn't not recognize it.
Yeah, that's well possible that the facade of the letter was just broken, and that he just didn't care anymore.
I guess a good way to wrap up today is, what's your overall thoughts of this movie, and maybe make an appeal to people who might be turned off by Tarantino, that it's a little too violent, it's a little too much for me. What's your appeal for someone to overcome maybe some of their qualms about Tarantino and watch this one, The Hateful Eight?
Yeah, I mean, well, I certainly won't say. One sentence you'll never hear me say is go see the newest Tarantino movie. I promise there's hardly any violence at all. But I will say the violence that's exercised in the movie is done very tastefully. Well, very tastefully. That's stupid. The violence that's executed is done very creatively, and it's very fun to watch. And it's sort of, in my opinion, it takes on a little bit of the Kill Bill delivery of violence, in that it's more cartoony, more parodious, more parodic. I'm not sure what the word is.
They sound good.
yeah. Both sound intelligent, right? Even if it's gibberish. I would say give it a shot. One thing that separates this movie, I think, from the other Tarantino movies is there's more of a hint of mystery to it than we see in the rest of his movies, which is done very well. And I'd recommend going to see it.